The night my daughter-in-law laughed in my face and told me to find my own place was the moment something inside me went completely still. Not angry, not broken, just finished. My son stood there in the doorway with his arms crossed, nodding along like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Like the years I had poured into their lives, the sacrifices I had made, without ever asking for recognition, could be erased with a casual conversation over morning coffee. They spoke to me as if I were a tenant who had overstayed her welcome, not the woman who had quietly kept their world from falling apart, while I grieved alone in a room that still smelled like my late husband's cologne. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked around the kitchen I had helped renovate, at the furniture I had helped them buy, at the life I had helped them build, and I realized they truly believed they had done it all themselves. That night, I packed 2 suitcases and walked out without slamming a single door. What they didn't know was that silence can be sharper than any confrontation. Over the following weeks, I watched from a careful distance as their confidence turned to confusion, then confusion turned to panic. Bills went unpaid, calls went unanswered, and then one evening, my phone rang. Her voice was sharp with desperation, stripped of all that arrogance, demanding to know what I had done. In that moment, I understood something powerful. Revenge doesn't always arrive with shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it comes calmly, deliberately, and with perfect timing. Stay with me, because what I chose to say next didn't just change their lives, it gave me back mine. And the truth behind it will leave you questioning how many quiet women you've underestimated. My name is Catherine Hayes. I'm 64 years old, a former high school English teacher who spent 37 years shaping young minds in classrooms across the Midwest. My husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago, and since then, I've been living in my son's guest bedroom, trying to be helpful, trying to stay out of the way, trying to prove I still had value in a world that seemed to have forgotten I existed. What I didn't realize until that morning was how completely I had erased myself in the process. The conversation started during breakfast on a Tuesday. It was one of those deceptively ordinary mornings where sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows and the smell of coffee filled the air. My son, Marcus, was scrolling through his phone at the table. His wife, Vanessa, was wiping down counters with the kind of aggressive efficiency that always made me feel like I was in the way. I was washing dishes from the meal I had prepared for them, as I did every morning, moving quietly so as not to disturb whatever rhythm they had established in their home, a home I had helped them purchase. Vanessa didn't even look at me when she spoke. She addressed Marcus as if I were invisible, as if I weren't standing 6 feet away with soapy hands and a dishcloth. "We need to talk about the timeline," she said, her voice brisk and businesslike. "My parents are planning to visit in October, and they'll need a place to stay. Catherine's room would be perfect for them. We should probably figure out when she's moving out." I froze. The plate I was holding slipped slightly in my wet hands, but I caught it before it fell. I waited for Marcus to say something, to remind his wife that I was his mother, that I was standing right there, that I deserved at least the courtesy of being included in conversations about my own future. But my son didn't look up from his phone. He just shrugged and mumbled something about talking later. The silence that followed was louder than any scream. I set the plate down carefully in the dish rack, dried my hands on a towel, and turned to look at them both. Marcus still hadn't lifted his eyes. Vanessa had moved on to organizing the fruit bowl, rearranging apples and oranges with the same detached focus she brought to everything that didn't serve her immediate interests. I walked to my room, the guest room, as Vanessa always made sure to call it, and closed the door behind me. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. His hands had graded thousands of essays, held my husband through his final days, signed checks that kept Marcus and Vanessa afloat through every crisis they'd faced in the last decade. These hands had worked, given, sacrificed. And yet somehow, Those same hands had failed to build a life where I was wanted. I thought about the photograph on my nightstand, the one of Robert and me on our 25th wedding anniversary. He was smiling that knowing smile he always had, the one that said he could see through people's pretenses faster than anyone I'd ever known. I could almost hear his voice in my head, calm and measured, the way it always was when he was delivering an uncomfortable truth. When people show you who they are, Catherine, believe them the first time, and when that day comes, call Diane first. Those were among his last words to me, spoken in the hospital 2 weeks before he slipped away. I hadn't understood them at the time. I thought the medication was making him confused, pulling up random memories that didn't quite fit together. But Robert was never confused. He was the sharpest man I'd ever known, and he had seen something I refused to see. He had tried to warn me. There was nothing left to explain to people who had stopped listening years ago. At 11:30 that night, I walked out the front door of my son's house, the door I had helped him afford, the house I had helped him maintain, the family I had supported through every setback and struggle for more than 10 years. No one heard me leave. No one called after me. The porch light stayed off. I drove for nearly 2 hours before I pulled into the parking lot of a roadside inn about 40 miles outside of town. It was the kind of place where no one asks questions, and the sheets smell faintly of lavender detergent. I paid cash for a week, and carried my 2 suitcases into a room with a painting of a meadow bolted to the wall and a window that looked out onto a quiet country road. It was past midnight when I finally sat down on the edge of the bed. The silence was different here. Not the cold, dismissive silence of my son's house, but something emptier, something that invited memory. And memory came, whether I wanted it or not. I thought about the last 10 years, the checks I had written, the problems I had solved, the weight I had carried so quietly that no one ever noticed I was carrying anything at all. When Marcus and Vanessa bought their house, they were short on the down payment by nearly $18,000. I covered it without hesitation, without any expectation of repayment. It was what mothers did, I told myself. You help your children build their lives. When the roofs needed replacing 4 years later, I wrote another check, $52,000 for a complete renovation. New shingles, updated insulation, repairs to the chimney. Vanessa had been so proud of that roof. She'd hosted a garden party the following spring, showing off the house to her friends, talking about how she and Marcus had finally made it. I'd been in the kitchen that day, refilling drink pitchers and clearing plates, trying to be helpful without intruding. Then there was her car. Vanessa had totaled her sedan in a winter accident, and insurance barely covered half the replacement cost. Marcus called me late one night, his voice tight with stress, and I transferred $38,000 into their account before the weekend was over. Vanessa never thanked me, not once. The new car simply appeared in their driveway, as if it had materialized through sheer force of her own success. The private school fees for their daughter, my granddaughter Lily, came next. $32,000, spread across 4 years, paid directly to the academy so Lily could attend the same prestigious school as Vanessa's friends' children. I remember writing those checks at my kitchen table, Robert watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. He never told me not to help, but he never told me I was making a difference either. Perhaps he knew something I didn't. There were countless smaller expenses too, groceries when money was tight, emergency repairs when appliances failed, birthday gifts and holiday contributions, quiet transfers whenever Marcus's voice carried that particular note of shame that told me they were drowning again. I never asked for gratitude. I told myself that family didn't keep score, that love meant giving without expectation. But sitting in that inn room, listening to the distant hum of traffic on the country road, I began to wonder if I had confused generosity with invisibility. One memory surfaced sharper than the others, a dinner party at Marcus's house about 5 years ago. Vanessa had invited several couples from her social circle, women with designer handbags and men who talked about stock portfolios and vacation homes. I stayed in the kitchen most of the evening, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, trying to be helpful without intruding. That was when I heard Vanessa's voice carry through the doorway. She was laughing, gesturing around the renovated dining room with obvious pride. One of her friends had complimented the house, asked how they managed such a beautiful home on their salaries. "We're completely self-made," Vanessa said, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "No help from anyone. Marcus and I built this life ourselves." I stood frozen by the sink, a serving platter in my hands. I waited for Marcus to correct her. He was sitting right there at the head of the table. He knew where the money had come from. He knew who had made their comfortable life possible. But my son said nothing. He simply smiled and raised his glass in a silent toast to their success. I never mentioned what I heard. I told myself it didn't matter, that pride sometimes makes people forget the truth. But the words stayed with me longer than they should have, like a splinter buried too deep to reach. Another memory followed, softer but no less significant. A summer afternoon, 2 years before Robert died. I came home early from running errands and found him leaning over the back fence, deep in conversation with our neighbor, Diane Mitchell. They stopped talking the moment they saw me, their expressions shifting into something carefully neutral. "What were you two discussing?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Robert smiled that mysterious smile he'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. "Just planning for the future, my dear." I didn't press further. I never pressed Robert on anything. I trusted him completely, and perhaps that trust made me blind to things I should have seen. What I didn't know then was that Robert had spent years watching what happened to Diane. 12 years earlier, Diane's own daughter-in-law had orchestrated her removal from the family home. Legal maneuvers, emotional manipulation, a son too weak to stand against his wife. Diane lost everything: her house, her savings, her place in her own family. Robert had been furious about it for months. I remember him pacing our living room, his voice sharp with outrage. How could he let that happen to his own mother? How could he just stand there and watch? And then, quieter, almost to himself. "That will never happen to Catherine. Never." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I thought he was simply expressing sympathy for a neighbor's misfortune. But Robert never said anything without purpose. Every word he spoke was a seed planted for a harvest I couldn't yet see. Sitting in that inn room, surrounded by the smell of lavender and the sounds of an unfamiliar place, I finally began to understand. I hadn't been generous. I had been invisible. And Robert had seen everything I refused to see. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The first morning in that inn room began with silence. Not the oppressive silence of being ignored, but something different. Something that belonged to me alone. I woke before dawn and sat by the window in the room's single chair. The curtains were thin, letting in the gray light of early morning and the occasional car passing on the country road below. $75 a night bought me clean sheets, a working television I never turned on, and a view of strangers going somewhere else. It was more than enough. I waited for the anger to arrive. I had expected it the night before. Expected to lie awake with my fists clenched and my mind racing through all the things I should have said, the confrontations I should have demanded, the boundaries I should have drawn years ago. I waited for rage to fill the hollow space in my chest, to give me something to push against, something to fuel whatever came next. But anger never came. What settled over me instead was something colder and quieter. A recognition that had been building for years. buried beneath all my excuses and rationalizations. I hadn't been mistreated suddenly. I had been erased gradually, so slowly that I barely noticed the disappearing. First, I was the mother who helped. Then, I was the mother who was expected to help. Then, I was simply the help itself, function rather than person. And finally, I wasn't even that. I was furniture. I was an inconvenience occupying a room that Vanessa needed for something else. The problem had never been about money. I understood that now with a clarity that felt almost painful. I could have given them twice as much, 3 times as much, and nothing would have changed. Because the issue wasn't what I provided. The issue was how they saw me. Somewhere along the way, Marcus stopped seeing his mother and started seeing a resource. Vanessa never saw me at all. I was simply part of the infrastructure of their lives, like plumbing or electricity. Useful when functioning, irritating when noticed. I thought about calling Marcus. I thought about demanding an explanation, an apology, some acknowledgement that I deserved better than to be discussed like an unwanted house guest in my own presence. I imagined the conversation in my head, the words I would choose, the points I would make. I had been a teacher for 37 years. I knew how to build arguments, the same way I knew how to build lesson plans. Strong foundations, logical progression, evidence distributed properly so nothing collapsed under scrutiny. But then I imagined Marcus's response, the defensiveness, the excuses, Vanessa's voice in the background, coaching him on what to say. The eventual compromise where I would be allowed back into the guest room with vague promises that things would be different, promises that would dissolve within weeks. I would return to the same silence, the same invisibility, the same slow erasure. Nothing would change because nothing could change. They didn't see me as someone worth changing for. So I made a different decision. I would not argue. I would not explain. I would not plead my case or defend my dignity or try to convince people who had already made up their minds. I would simply remove myself completely. No dramatic exit, no bitter accusations, no desperate attempts to make them understand what they had done. I would just stop. Stop calling. Stop helping. Stop existing in their world. Let them experience life without my invisible support. Let the bills arrive that I had always quietly covered. Let the emergencies happen that I had always quietly solved. Let them discover, piece by piece, exactly how much I'd been holding together, without anyone noticing or caring. This wasn't revenge. Revenge requires anger, and I had none left to give. This was something simpler. This was me, finally, after 64 years on this earth, deciding that I mattered enough to stop giving myself away to people who didn't value the gift. I sat by that window for a long time, watching the traffic on the country road increase as morning turned to midday. Trucks hauling freight to distant cities, families in minivans heading toward vacations, salespeople in sedans rushing to appointments. Everyone moving, everyone going somewhere, everyone with a purpose that had nothing to do with me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something like peace. I had spent my entire adult life filling silence with usefulness. If I was helping, I was worthy. If I was providing, I was loved. I had never learned how to simply exist without earning my place. But sitting in that inn room, watching the world pass by outside my window, I began to understand that some silences aren't empty. Some silences are statements. Some silences are the loudest thing a woman can say. I would not beg for a seat at their table. I would not explain why I deserved to be treated with basic dignity. I would not teach grown adults lessons they should have learned decades ago. I would simply be silent, and let that silence speak for itself. Silence wasn't weakness. It was my first boundary in 64 years. On the third morning, I found the courage to make the call I had been avoiding. Robert's final words had stayed with me through every sleepless hour in that inn room. When people show you who they are, Catherine, believe them the first time. And when that day comes, call Diane first. I had carried those words like a seed envelope, never quite understanding what they meant, never ready to find out. But sitting alone in that small room, with nothing but country sounds and my own thoughts for company, I realized I had run out of reasons to wait. Diane Mitchell had been our neighbor for nearly 25 years. She had handled Robert's estate planning, our property documents, the quiet legal architecture that held a lifetime together. Robert trusted her completely, and that trust had always been enough for me. But I hadn't spoken to Diane since Robert's funeral. I wasn't sure she would even remember me. I dialed her number from memory. She answered on the second ring, her voice worn and immediate, as if she'd been expecting my call. "Catherine," she said, and there was something in her tone I couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps, or anticipation? "I've been waiting to hear from you for 3 years." I didn't know how to respond to that. I had expected pleasantries, condolences, the usual awkward dance of reconnection after a long silence. Instead, Diane spoke as if she had been counting the days until this moment. Robert left instructions. She continued before I could find words. Very specific instructions. He made me promise to follow them exactly, no matter how long it took. Instructions about what? My voice came out smaller than I intended. About you. About what to do when you finally called. She paused, and I heard papers shuffling on her end. He left a sealed envelope in my care. The conditions were explicit. I could only open it when you left your son's house. Not before, not under any other circumstances. Only when you walked away from Marcus and Vanessa on your own terms. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. "He knew," I said quietly. "He knew this would happen." He didn't know exactly when. Diane's voice softened with something like admiration, but he knew who. Robert called Vanessa the one who measures other people's worth in dollars. He said he'd been watching that woman calculate your value since the day Marcus brought her home. He told me it was only a matter of time before she decided you'd given enough. I closed my eyes and saw my husband's face. That knowing smile, those sharp eyes that missed nothing. All those years I thought I was protecting our family, and Robert had been protecting me. "What's in the envelope?" I asked. "Property documents. The house on Willow Lane, where you and Robert lived for 30 years. Your family home." She paused to let the words settle. "Robert transferred it into your name alone, 4 years before he died. Full ownership. No joint title with Marcus. No inheritance complications. It's yours, Catherine. It's always been yours. Worth somewhere around $420,000 at current market value." I couldn't speak. The house on Willow Lane had been our sanctuary, the place where we'd raised Marcus, where we'd celebrated holidays and weathered storms. I had assumed it would eventually pass to Marcus as part of our estate, another piece of myself that I would give away without question. But Robert had seen further than I ever could. "Vanessa can't touch it," Diane continued. "Marcus has no legal claim. Robert made certain of that. He restructured everything quietly, made sure the paperwork was airtight. He told me once that he wasn't trying to punish anyone. He was trying to make sure you had somewhere to land when they finally pushed you out the door." My throat tightened. 40 years of marriage, and Robert was still taking care of me. Still anticipating the dangers I refused to see. Still building bridges to safety that I didn't know I would need. "There's something else," Diane said carefully. "A second envelope. Robert was very clear that I shouldn't mention it until you were ready." "And you're not ready yet, Catherine. Not today." "What do you mean?" I mean, there's more to this than property transfers. Robert documented things, observations, patterns he noticed over the years. She chose her next words with obvious care. He wanted you to understand the full picture eventually. But he also knew that some truths need time to be received. You've just walked away from your son's house. You're still processing what happened. The second envelope can wait. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand that she tell me everything immediately. That she stop parceling out my husband's final gifts like medicine administered in careful doses. But something in her tone stopped me. Diane had known Robert for decades. If she said I wasn't ready, perhaps she was right. When? I asked. When you've stopped reacting and started rebuilding. You'll know. And when that day comes, call me again. I thanked her and ended the call. For a long time afterward, I sat motionless in that inn room, staring at the phone in my hands as if it might speak again, might offer some further piece of the puzzle Robert had constructed. My husband had protected me from beyond the grave, but Diane said there was more. A second envelope waiting for later. The bills arrived at Marcus's house on a Wednesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after I walked out the front door. I wasn't there to witness it, of course, but I knew those bills intimately. I had been paying them quietly for years, intercepting the envelopes before anyone else saw them, writing checks from my own account so that Marcus and Vanessa could maintain the illusion that their comfortable life was entirely self-made. Homeowners insurance at $2,800 per quarter. Property tax installments that climbed higher every year. The lawn service that kept their yard pristine. The security system that let Vanessa sleep soundly at night. These were the invisible threads I had been weaving around their lives, and now those threads were unraveling. Marcus called me that afternoon. His voice carried the particular strain of someone trying to sound calm while standing in the middle of a crisis he doesn't fully understand. Mom, there's been some kind of mix-up with the mail. We're getting bills for things I've never even heard of. Insurance, property taxes, some landscaping company. He paused, and I could hear Vanessa's voice sharp in the background, though I couldn't make out her words. Did you maybe forget to mention some arrangements you had? Something about automatic payments? I listened without interrupting. It was strange how distant his problems felt now, as if he were describing difficulties happening to someone else entirely. I didn't forget anything, Marcus. Those bills have always existed. I just handled them. Silence on the other end. Then Vanessa's voice again, closer now, demanding to know what I was saying. We'll manage, Marcus said finally, though his voice wavered in a way that suggested he wasn't entirely sure. It's just a lot to sort through all at once. I could picture the scene without effort. Vanessa standing in their kitchen, surrounded by envelopes she had never noticed before. A carefully constructed sense of control, crumbling with each new number she encountered. She would be pacing by now, I imagined, slamming papers down on the counter, muttering about being set up, about traps laid by a bitter old woman who couldn't accept her place. This was never about the money for Vanessa. It was about the fact that something had been happening in her own house without her knowledge or permission. It was about discovering that her life had been quietly subsidized by someone she considered beneath her notice. The bills themselves were manageable. The loss of control was not. There's nothing to sort through, I said calmly. Those are your responsibilities now. I'm sure you'll figure it out. I ended the call before he could respond. Later, that same afternoon, there was a knock at my in-room door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I had told no one where I was staying, had made no arrangements for visitors, had assumed I would spend these early days in complete solitude while I figured out what came next. But when I opened the door, Diane Mitchell stood in the hallway, holding a container of homemade soup. She smiled as if my surprise was exactly what she had anticipated. Chicken and rice, she said, pressing the warm container into my hands. Robert's recipe, He made me promise to learn it. I stepped aside to let her in. Diane settled into the room's single chair as if she had been there many times before, her eyes taking in the sparse furnishings without judgment. "How did you know where I was?" I finally asked. "Small town, Catherine. Word travels." But her expression suggested there was more to it than small town gossip. "I've been waiting to hear that you'd finally left. Robert told me years ago that this day would come. He just didn't know exactly when." I sat down on the edge of the bed, the soup container warming my hands. Diane watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Sympathy, perhaps, but also something fiercer, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Rabbit always said you were stronger than you looked." Diane continued. "He said you had a quiet kind of strength that people mistook for weakness, the kind that bends without breaking." She paused, her gaze steady. "He was right. You're still standing." I didn't feel strong. I felt hollowed out, uncertain, like a woman who had stepped off a cliff and was still waiting to discover whether she would fall or fly. That Diane's words settled over me like a blanket I hadn't known I needed. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about the neighborhood, about the changes since I had been gone, about the small dramas that occupied people who had nothing larger to worry about. She didn't ask what had happened with Marcus and Vanessa. She didn't offer advice or platitudes. She simply sat with me in that cramped inn-room and reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. Before she left, Diane mentioned something almost as an afterthought. "I ran into your son's wife at the grocery store yesterday. She was talking to someone on her phone, didn't see me in the next aisle." Diane's voice turned carefully neutral. She said something about her parents visiting more often now that things were settling. Maybe staying a while. Something about the back room being perfect for them. The back room. My room. A space Vanessa had needed for something else. I thanked Diane for the soup and watched her drive away from the inn parking lot. Then I sat by the window for a long time, thinking about rooms and replacements and the ease with which some people discard what they no longer find useful. Comfort feels fragile when no one is quietly fixing things, and I was done fixing. The weeks that followed brought news in fragments, pieces of a picture I could assemble without being present to witness it myself. Diane stopped by the inn every few days, always with some small offering: soup, bread, once a slice of apple pie from the bakery she frequented. She never stayed long, but she always brought information. In a small town, she explained, people talk, and Vanessa had given them plenty to talk about. The vacation was the first thing to go. Marcus and Vanessa had been planning a trip to the coast for months, the kind of getaway Vanessa loved to mention at social gatherings. Beach resort, spa treatments, a week of carefully curated photographs to share with friends who measured success by the destinations one could afford. But the trip was quietly cancelled. Vanessa told her book club that something had come up with Marcus's work, that they would reschedule for next year, but Diane's friend from the book club noticed the way Vanessa's smile tightened when she said it. Then came the car. Vanessa had been talking about replacing her sedan since the previous spring, visiting dealerships on weekends, leaving brochures on the kitchen counter where Marcus couldn't miss them. A luxury crossover with leather seats and a navigation system she would never learn to use. But the brochures disappeared, and the weekend dealership visits stopped. When someone asked about the new car, Vanessa changed the subject. The dining out slowed to a trickle. No more spontaneous dinners at the upscale bistro downtown. No more brunches with friends at the cafe with the expensive mimosas. Vanessa started cooking at home more often, something she had always claimed to despise. The lifestyle she had presented so carefully to her social circle was beginning to crack, and everyone who knew her could see the fractures spreading. I understood, even from a distance, that the money itself wasn't what tortured Vanessa. She and Marcus weren't poor. They had good jobs, a manageable mortgage, savings that most families would envy. What I had been providing wasn't survival. It was comfort. It was the difference between a life that looked successful and a life that looked extraordinary. What tortured Vanessa was the loss of control. For years, she had believed herself the architect of her own circumstances. She made the decisions. She set the standards. She determined what their life would look like and how others would perceive it. But now she was discovering that someone else had been quietly holding the strings, and those strings had been cut without her permission. She called me on a Thursday evening. I was sitting by the inn window, watching the sunset paint the country road in shades of orange and gold, when her name appeared on my phone screen. I considered not answering, but something made me pick up. Perhaps I wanted to hear what she would say. Perhaps I wanted to confirm what I already knew about who she really was. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Her voice was sharp, accusatory, the tone of someone who had spent days rehearsing this confrontation. "Walking out in the middle of the night like some kind of martyr, making us look like monsters? Is that what you wanted? To punish us? To make everyone feel sorry for poor Catherine?" I let her words wash over me without responding. She wasn't asking questions. She was making accusations dressed up as questions, the kind that expected no answer because the answer didn't matter. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Vanessa. I'm just living my life." "Living your life?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You're hiding in some inn, feeling sorry for yourself while we're left dealing with the mess you created. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" "I hasn't done anything to your family. I simply stopped doing things for your family." "There's a difference." Silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her searching for the next attack, the next angle that might wound me into submission. "Nothing," I said. "I'm just living my life." I repeated it calmly, and then I hung up. I didn't answer when she called back. I didn't respond to the text messages that followed, each one more desperate and angry than the last. I simply turned off my phone and watched the last light fade from the sky. Marcus called the next morning. His voice was different from Vanessa's, quieter, more uncertain. He didn't accuse or attack. He asked how I was doing, whether I needed anything, whether I had thought about coming back. I answered politely but briefly. I was fine. I didn't need anything. I had not thought about coming back. Before he hung up, Marcus mentioned something almost in passing. He had been looking at their bank statements, trying to understand where all the money was going now that unexpected expenses kept appearing. He noticed some transfers he didn't recognize, money moving to an account that wasn't theirs. "I started to ask Vanessa about it," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "But she gave me this look. You know the one." So I just closed the laptop and didn't bring it up again. I knew the look. I had seen it many times over the years. The look that said certain questions weren't welcome, that certain boundaries should not be crossed, that peace in the household depended on not noticing things that demanded to be noticed. Marcus also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Vanessa had been measuring my old room the week before. She had walked through it with a tape measure, making notes on her phone, talking about possibilities. She said it would make a perfect guest room, or maybe an office for her father. Marcus paused. I didn't really think about it at the time, but now I'm not sure what to think. I thanked him for calling and ended the conversation. For a long time afterward, I sat with what he had told me. The strange transfers, the measured room, the plans being made without his knowledge or consent. Vanessa wasn't just losing control of her circumstances. She was building something else, something hidden, something that even Marcus wasn't allowed to see. Power feels different when it no longer listens to you. Marcus came to see me 5 days later. He arrived at the inn without calling ahead, his car pulling into the parking lot just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. I watched him through the window, sitting in his vehicle for several minutes before he finally stepped out and walked toward my door. His shoulders were hunched in a way I had never seen before, carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for his frame. When I opened the door, he didn't greet me. He simply walked past me into the room and sat down in the single chair, staring at the floor. I closed the door and waited. Whatever had brought him here, he needed to find his own way to say it. "I came home early yesterday," he finally said. His voice was flat, drained of its usual defensive energy. "Left work around 2 because I had a migraine. Vanessa didn't know I was coming." He paused, and I could see him replaying something in his mind, watching a scene unfold behind his eyes that he wished he could unsee. "She was on the phone when I came in through the garage, talking to her mother. She didn't hear me." Marcus's hands clenched in his lap. Her voice was different. Excited, like she was sharing a secret with someone she trusted completely. I stood in the hallway and listened. I said nothing. I could feel the shape of what was coming, the confirmation of suspicions I had been carrying since Diane first mentioned Vanessa's plans for my room. She said, "Once she's officially out of the picture, you and Dad can move in. The room's already empty. We just need to wait a few more weeks for everything to settle." Daniel looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Shame, perhaps, or the particular pain of someone who has finally allowed themselves to see what was always there. She wasn't talking about a visit, Mum. She was talking about replacement. Your room. Your place in our house. She wanted to erase you and put her own parents there instead. The words hung in the air between us. I had suspected something like this since Diane's report about the grocery store conversation, but hearing it confirmed, hearing my own son describe his wife's calculated plan to substitute me with people who would worship her rather than see through her, carried a weight that suspicion alone could not match. Strong P. Stood there in that hallway, for I don't know how long, Marcus continued, just frozen, trying to understand what I was hearing. And then I started thinking about everything else, all the little things I'd been noticing but refusing to put together. By then I started thinking about the patterns he had begun to see, how Vanessa questioned every expense that didn't directly benefit her, but never hesitated to spend on things that enhanced her image. How she spoke about the future in terms that always centered herself, her comfort, her preferences. How she had been measuring and planning and preparing for a version of their life that had no room for anyone who might challenge her control. "I thought about all the times she said things about you," Marcus said quietly. "All the comments I pretended not to hear. The way she talked about you, like you were a burden we were generous enough to tolerate. And I never said anything. Not once. I just sat there and let it happen, because I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to rock the boat. I chose peace over loyalty. I chose being comfortable over being your son." His voice cracked on the last word. I watched my son struggle with the recognition of who he had allowed himself to become, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not satisfaction at his suffering. Something closer to sorrow, for both of us, for the years we had lost to silence and avoidance. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Marcus shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet, but I'm watching now. Everything she says, everything she does, every plan she makes. I'm paying attention in a way I never did before." He met my eyes. "I'm not confronting her. Not yet. I need to understand the full picture first. I need to know what else she's been hiding." I recognized something in his words, in his approach. It was the same strategy I had adopted weeks earlier, in this very room. No arguments, no accusations, just quiet observation, letting the truth reveal itself piece by piece. "The money transfers," he added. "I've been looking into them. She's been moving funds to an account I didn't know existed. Not huge amounts, but steady, A few hundred here, a few hundred there. Building something. I don't know what yet. He stood up to leave, pausing at the door with his hand on the frame. I'm sorry, Mom. For everything. For not standing up for you. For pretending I didn't see what was happening in my own house. He swallowed hard. I can't change what I did, but I can change what I do next. End of part 2. I nodded, but did not offer the reassurance he might have been seeking. Some wounds cannot be healed with words. Some trust must be rebuilt through action alone. Marcus seemed to understand this. He didn't ask for forgiveness or absolution. He simply left, driving away into the gathering dusk. Strong. I stood by the window long after his taillights disappeared, thinking about silence and its many meanings. For years, Marcus's silence had been a weapon that cut me without leaving visible wounds. His refusal to speak, to defend, to acknowledge what was happening right in front of him. That silence had been complicity dressed as neutrality, betrayal disguised as peace. But now his silence had changed. It was no longer about fear or avoidance. It was about gathering evidence, building a case, preparing for a confrontation that might cost him everything he thought he had. A son's silence can wound deeper than words. But for the first time, Marcus's silence wasn't about fear. It was about watching. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. The week after Marcus's visit passed quietly. I had moved out of the inn by then, using some of the money Diane had helped me access to rent a small furnished apartment in a different town, about 30 miles from where Marcus and Vanessa lived. Nothing fancy, just a bedroom, a kitchenette, and a window that looked out over a tree-lined street instead of a country road. It was mine. That was enough. I spent my days establishing small routines. Morning coffee at a cafe 3 blocks away, afternoon walks through the local park, evenings reading books I'd been meaning to finish for years. The silence that surrounded me now was different from the silence of Marcus's house. It wasn't the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being left alone. And I discovered that the two were not the same thing at all. I thought often about what Marcus had told me. Vanessa's phone call with her mother. The plans she had been making. The secret account she had been building. I wondered what he was discovering as he watched her more carefully. What other patterns were emerging from the background noise of their marriage? But I didn't call him to ask. This was his journey now. His reckoning with the woman he had chosen over his own mother. He would have to find his own way through it. The property tax bill arrived at Marcus's house on a Friday afternoon. I knew because Marcus sent me a brief text message that evening. Just 2 sentences. Big tax bill came today. Vanessa is not handling it well. Then I could imagine the scene without difficulty. The envelope from the county assessor's office, the kind of official correspondence that demands attention. Vanessa tearing it open, expecting something routine, finding instead a statement for $9,500, due within 30 days. Her confusion would have been genuine. She had no idea this expense existed, because I had always handled it quietly, just like everything else. It was one of the larger invisible threads I had been weaving around their lives, and now it had snapped. I did not respond to Marcus's message. There was nothing for me to say. The call came at 10:30 that night. I was already in bed, not quite asleep, but drifting toward it. When my phone lit up with Vanessa's name, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Perhaps I wanted to hear what she would say when her carefully constructed world was crumbling. Perhaps I wanted to witness the moment when control finally slipped beyond her reach. "This is your fault." Her voice hit me before I could even say hello. It cracked and wavered, caught somewhere between fury and tears. "You planned this. You set us up to fail. You've been waiting for this moment, haven't you? Waiting to watch us drown while you sit in your little apartment feeling superior. I said nothing. I simply listened as she continued, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of accusation and self-pity. $9,500. $9,500 we don't have because you've been sabotaging us from the beginning. All those bills you never told us about. All those expenses you hid from us so you could spring them on us later. You wanted this to happen. You wanted to punish us for asking you to leave. Well, congratulations, you got what you wanted. Are you happy now? She was crying by this point, the angry tears of someone who has lost control and cannot understand how it happened. I listened to her sobs, her ragged breathing, the occasional curse she threw at me between gasps. I let her exhaust herself, let the storm of her emotions spend its energy against the wall of my silence. When she finally paused, I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, carrying no anger and no satisfaction, just simple truth. I didn't plan anything, Vanessa. I didn't set you up. I didn't hide expenses to punish you later. Those bills existed all along. You just never saw them because I was always there to catch them before they reached you. I paused, letting the words settle. I didn't do anything to you. I just stopped doing things for you. I stopped catching you when you fell. That's not sabotage. That's just gravity. Silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her searching for a response, a counterattack, something that would shift the blame back onto my shoulders, where she so desperately wanted it to stay. You could help us, she finally said, her voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier fury. You could fix this. You have the money. I know you do. You could make this all go away. I could, I agreed. But I won't. Why? The word came out as almost a whisper. Because you don't need me to fix your problems, Vanessa. You need to learn that your problems exist. You need to understand that the life you've been living was never entirely yours. It was built on foundations you didn't lay and maintained by hands you never thanked. I took a breath. I'm not punishing you. I'm just not saving you anymore. There's a difference. Starla, I hung up before she could respond. Then I turned off my phone and set it on the nightstand, face down, where its silence could not be broken. Pete, for a long time, I lay in the darkness of my small apartment, listening to the distant sounds of traffic and the settling of an unfamiliar building. I waited for guilt to arrive, for regret to creep in around the edges of what I had done. Vanessa was suffering. Her comfortable life was collapsing, and I had the power to stop it, to write a check and make it all go away, to return to being the invisible provider who kept everything running smoothly. Pete. But the guilt did not come. Neither did the regret. Pete. But the guilt did not come. What came instead was something I hadn't felt in years, a loosening in my chest, a release of tension I hadn't even known I was carrying. For a decade, I had been holding up a structure that no one else could see, bearing a weight that no one acknowledged, afraid that if I stopped even for a moment, everything would come crashing down. Now I had stopped, and I was still standing. The crash was happening somewhere else, to people who had never appreciated what they stood upon. This time, I did not rescue her. And for the first time in a decade, I slept through the night. Thomas, I'm sorry. Diane called me the following Monday morning. Her voice carried that same careful weight I remembered from our first conversation, the tone of someone about to deliver something significant. You're ready for the rest now, she said without preamble. Can you come to my office this afternoon? I drove the 30 miles to her law practice with my heart pounding against my ribs. The second envelope, the one Robert had left for later, for when I was strong enough to receive whatever truth it contained. I had thought about it often during my weeks in the inn, and the quiet days in my new apartment. I had wondered what secrets my husband had been keeping, what observations he had recorded, what final message he had wanted me to hear. Only after I had walked away from everything he knew, I would eventually have to leave. Diane's office was located in a small professional building on a quiet street lined with oak trees. I had been there a few times over the years, signing documents and reviewing plans, but today the familiar surroundings felt charged with something I couldn't name. The receptionist showed me directly to Diane's private office, where she waited behind her desk with a manila envelope in her hands. "Sit down, Catherine," he gestured to the leather chair across from her. "This may take some time." She slid the envelope across the desk. It was heavier than I expected, thick with whatever Robert had left inside. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a journal, leather-bound, the kind Robert had always preferred for his personal writing. The cover was worn from handling, the pages filled with his familiar handwriting. I recognized the precise letters immediately, the way he formed his words with such deliberate care. "He kept this during his final 3 years," Diane explained quietly. "He gave it to me 8 months before he passed, with instructions that it should only be opened after you had left Marcus's house. He wanted you to understand what he had seen." I opened the journal to the first entry. The date was written in the upper corner, nearly 4 years ago. Robert's words greeted me like a voice from beyond the grave. "Catherine brought over another check for Marcus today. $1,400 for some emergency Vanessa manufactured." I watched her face when she wrote it. The way she smiled as if the money was nothing, as if giving meant nothing. But I saw the bank statement last week. She's been dipping into our retirement savings. She doesn't tell me because she knows I'd object. She thinks if she gives enough, they will finally see her. They will finally love her the way she deserves to be loved. But Vanessa doesn't love. She calculates. And Marcus has forgotten how to be a son. I turned the page, then another. Entry after entry, spanning months and years. Robert had documented everything. Every dismissive comment Vanessa made when she thought no one important was listening. Every time Marcus looked away when his wife belittled his mother. Every holiday gathering where I was seated at the edge of the conversation, included in body but excluded in spirit. Every check I wrote. Every sacrifice I made. Every piece of myself I gave away to people who received without gratitude and took without acknowledgement. One entry stopped me cold. The date was 20 months before Robert died, during a family dinner I barely remembered. Vanessa told her friend tonight that they built their life themselves, with no help from anyone. Catherine was standing 10 feet away. She heard every word. I watched her face go still, watched her absorb the blow without flinching, watched her continue clearing plates as if nothing had happened. Later, I asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. She is not fine. She has not been fine for years. But she cannot see it, because seeing it would mean admitting that her sacrifices have purchased nothing. Her son is lost. Her daughter-in-law is a predator. And my wife, the strongest woman I have ever known, has been hollowed out so slowly that she does not recognize her own emptiness. The tears came without warning. It spilled down my cheeks and fell onto the pages of Robert's journal, blurring the ink of words he had written years ago. I wept for the first time since his funeral. Great, shuddering sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than grief. I wept for the years I had wasted, for the love I had misplaced, for the husband who had seen everything and tried to protect me, even when I refused to protect myself. Diane said nothing. She simply sat across from me and let me cry, understanding that some moments require witness rather than comfort. When I could breathe again, I turned to the final entry. The date was 4 weeks before Robert died. written in handwriting that trembled with the weakness of his failing body. I cannot protect her while I am alive. If I speak, they will call me the interfering father-in-law. They will poison Catherine against me, convince her that I am jealous or controlling or simply old and bitter. Vanessa is skilled at such manipulations. Marcus will believe whatever keeps the peace, so I must protect Catherine from beyond the grave. Everything is in place. The property is secured. The documents are signed. Diane knows what to do and when to do it. My only regret is that I will not be there to hold Catherine's hand when she finally sees the truth. But perhaps that is better. Perhaps she needs to find her strength alone, without me there to lean on. I love her. I've always loved her. And I will love her still, even when I'm gone. Even when she thinks she is alone, she is never alone. She carries me with her, always. I closed the journal and pressed it against my chest, holding it the way I wished I could hold him one more time. The tears continued to fall, but they were different now. Not just grief. Something cleaner. Something like release. Robert had left me more than property. He had left me the truth, documented, dated, and undeniable. I kept Robert's journal on my nightstand for weeks afterward. Some mornings I would wake before dawn and read a few entries, letting his voice fill the quiet darkness. Other times I couldn't bring myself to open it at all. The weight of his love and his loss pressing too heavily on my chest. But knowing it was there, knowing he had seen everything and still believed in me, changed something fundamental in the way I moved through my days. Diane began visiting more frequently after I told her about the journal. She would arrive in the late afternoon with small offerings, a loaf of bread from the bakery, or a bag of fresh peaches from the farmer's market. We would sit together in my apartment and talk about things I hadn't discussed with anyone in years. Robert, loss. The particular grief of being discarded by the families we had built with our own hands and hearts. Diane understood in ways that others could not. She had walked this road before me, 15 years earlier, when her own daughter-in-law had orchestrated her removal from the family she had spent decades nurturing. She knew the shame of feeling unwanted. She knew the confusion of wondering what she had done wrong, what she could have done differently, whether the fault lay in her own character rather than in the cruelty of others. And she knew the slow, painful process of rebuilding a life from the wreckage of betrayal. "You need a better place," she told me one afternoon, looking around my small apartment with a critical eye. "This is fine for recovering, but you're not recovering anymore. You're living. You need somewhere that feels like living." She helped me find a new apartment closer to the center of town. It was on the second floor of an older building, clean and bright, with large windows that looked out over a small community garden where neighbors grew tomatoes and herbs. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were friendly, and for the first time since I had walked out of Marcus's house, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than simply away. I discovered in those weeks that I had forgotten how to enjoy simple things. For so long, every pleasure had been shadowed by obligation, every moment of rest interrupted by the awareness that someone, somewhere, needed something from me. But now, with no one expecting anything, I found myself rediscovering the small satisfactions I had abandoned years ago. Morning coffee at the cafe, 4 blocks from my apartment. The barista learned my name and my order within a week, and there was something deeply comforting about being recognized for nothing more than showing up. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, examining vegetables I had no intention of buying, listening to conversations between strangers about weather and grandchildren and the price of heirloom tomatoes. Evenings spent reading novels I had started and abandoned during my years of invisible service, finally able to finish them without interruption. ML, one afternoon, Diane mentioned something that made me set down my tea and stare at her. Robert and I used to talk about you, she said carefully. A lot, actually. More than you probably realized. Emal. One afternoon, Diane mentioned something that made me set down my tea and stare at her. Robert and I used to talk about you. A lot, actually. More than you probably realized. What did you talk about? Everything. Your marriage, your son. The way you gave and gave without ever asking for anything in return. Diane paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. He made me promise something, Catherine, before he died. What kind of promise? She shook her head slowly. Not yet. You're stronger now than you were, but you're not ready for that conversation. When the time comes, I'll tell you everything, but not today. I wanted to press her. I wanted to demand answers the same way I had wanted to demand the second envelope before she was ready to give it. But I had learnt something about patience in recent weeks. Some truths need time to be received. Rushing them only diminishes their power. The community center became my unexpected anchor. I had wandered in one morning looking for information about volunteer opportunities, and the director, a warm woman named Patricia, had taken one look at my background and asked if I would consider helping elderly residents navigate the maze of paperwork that seemed to multiply with every passing year. Insurance forms, government benefits, medical documentation, the kind of bureaucratic complexity that could overwhelm people who had spent their lives working with their hands rather than pushing papers. I said yes without hesitation, and in that simple agreement, I found something I hadn't expected. Purpose. Not the purpose of being needed by people who took me for granted, not the purpose of solving problems so that others could pretend those problems never existed, but the purpose of being useful on my own terms, helping people who appreciated the help, making a difference that was acknowledged rather than invisible. The residents at the community center thanked me. They looked me in the eye when they spoke. They asked about my day and listened to my answers. Such small things, really. Common courtesies that most people take for granted. But after years of being treated as furniture in my own son's house, those small courtesies felt like gifts beyond measure. I was not a provider anymore. I was not a burden. I was not invisible. I was simply Catherine Hayes, 64 years old, a woman with the right to exist and the freedom to choose how that existence would unfold. For the first time in years, I felt present. Not needed, just present, and that was enough. They came to my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, 4 months after I had walked out of their house. I was returning from my volunteer shift at the community center when I saw Marcus's car parked in the visitor space near the building entrance. My steps slowed as I approached. I had known this moment would come eventually. Vanessa was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly. They were waiting in the hallway outside my door. Marcus stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the carpet. He looked like a man who would rather be anywhere else in the world. Vanessa stood beside him with perfect posture, her expression arranged into something soft and sorrowful. She had dressed carefully for this visit. Modest clothing, minimal makeup, the costume of a penitent daughter-in-law coming to make amends. "Mom," Marcus spoke first, his voice strained. "Can we come in? We'd like to talk." I unlocked the door and let them enter. My apartment was small but tidy, the afternoon sunlight falling through the windows that faced the community garden. Vanessa's eyes swept across the space, cataloging everything. The second-hand furniture, the books stacked on the coffee table, the photograph of Robert I had placed on the windowsill where the light touched it each morning. "Please, sit down," I said, gesturing to the couch. I took the chair across from them, maintaining distance. Vanessa began immediately, her voice trembling with what she wanted me to believe was genuine emotion. "Catherine, I've been doing a lot of thinking since you left. About how things were, about the mistakes I made." She dabbed at her eyes with the tissue she had been holding in her hand. clearly prepared for this performance. I was wrong. I see that now. The way I spoke to you, the things I said, it wasn't fair. I was stressed and overwhelmed, and I took it out on you. She paused, waiting for me to respond. I said nothing. We miss you, Mum, Marcus added, his voice breaking artfully on the words. The house feels so empty without you. I miss having my mother around. Lily asks about her grandmother. We're a family, and families should be together. Vanessa reached out, as if to touch my hand, then pulled back when I didn't move toward her. Please come home. We can start over. We can be the family we were always meant to be. I watched her performance with a clarity I hadn't possessed before. The rehearsed pauses, the strategic tears, the careful construction of words, designed to manipulate rather than communicate. I wondered how many times she had practiced this speech in front of a mirror, adjusting her expression until it conveyed the perfect blend of remorse and hope. You don't miss me, Vanessa. My voice was calm, carrying no anger and no accusation, just simple observation. You miss what I provided. There's a difference. Her expression flickered, a crack in the mask, quickly repaired. That's not true. We miss you. The person, the mother, the grandmother. Then why did you measure my room for your parents before I had even left? Why did you tell your mother they could move in once I was officially out of the picture? I watched her face carefully as I spoke. Marcus told me. He heard you on the phone. You weren't planning a family reunion. You were planning a replacement. The softness drained from Vanessa's features. Her posture stiffened. The tearful daughter-in-law disappeared, and in her place sat the woman I had come to know over 10 years of quiet observation. The calculator, the controller, the one who measured other people's worth in dollars, a former bring-the inventory. Her voice hardened, the pretense of reconciliation abandoned. We gave you a home when you had nowhere to go. We fed you, housed you, included you in our family. And this is how you repay us? By abandoning us when things get difficult. You owe us, Catherine. And strong period. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside her, but said nothing. He was watching now, I remembered, gathering information. But watching wasn't the same as acting. Strong period. What exactly did you do for me, Vanessa? I asked quietly. Name one thing. Silence. You gave me a room. In a house I helped pay for. You fed me meals at a table I helped buy. You included me in a family that treated me like furniture. I held her gaze without flinching. I paid for your renovations. I paid for your car. I paid for your daughter's education. I covered your insurance and your taxes and your emergencies. And in return, you gave me a bed and permission to exist in your presence. That's not generosity, Vanessa. That's tenancy. And the rent I paid was far higher than anything you provided. Her mouth opened and closed. For once, she had no response prepared, no manipulation ready to deploy. She had come expecting the old Catherine, the one who apologized for inconveniences she didn't cause, who smoothed over conflicts she didn't create, who retreated into silence rather than speak uncomfortable truths. But that Catherine no longer existed. I'm not coming back, I said. Not today, not ever. The version of me that lived in your house, that paid your bills without acknowledgement, that accepted your contempt as the price of belonging, that woman is gone. I buried her the same night I walked out your door. Vanessa stood abruptly, her composure shattered. You'll regret this, she said, her voice tight with fury. When you're old and sick and alone, you'll wish you hadn't thrown away the only family you had. I didn't throw away my family, Vanessa. My voice was steady. My family threw me away. I simply stopped pretending otherwise. She stormed out without another word. Marcus lingered for a moment, his eyes meeting mine with something that looked almost like respect. Then he followed his wife out the door, leaving me alone in my small apartment with the afternoon light and the distant sounds of children playing in the community garden below. I was not coming back to who I used to be, and she was finally starting to understand that. Marcus returned the next afternoon, alone. I heard his knock and knew before I opened the door that something had shifted. The rhythm was different, not the reluctant tap of a man accompanying his wife on an errand he wanted no part of. This was deliberate, purposeful, the knock of someone who had made a decision. He stood in the hallway, looking like he hadn't slept. His eyes were red-rimmed, his clothes wrinkled in a way that suggested he had put them on without thinking. The careful neutrality he had worn during yesterday's visit was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, the face of a man who had finally stopped pretending. "Can I come in?" His voice was hoarse. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you years ago." I stepped aside and let him enter. He didn't sit on the couch where he had perched uncomfortably beside Vanessa the day before. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the community garden, gathering himself for whatever confession he had come to deliver. "After we left yesterday, Vanessa and I had a fight," he began slowly. "Not about you. About money. She wanted to know why I'd been looking at our bank statements so carefully lately. I told her I was just being responsible. She didn't believe me." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Fear. Not the fear of confrontation that had kept him silent for so many years. Something deeper. The fear of finally seeing clearly. "I've been tracking those transfers, Mum. The ones to the account I didn't recognize. I finally figured out where the money was going." He swallowed hard. "She's been moving funds into a separate account. Her name only. $63,000 over the past 3 years. A little here, a little there. Always amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice unless I was looking." I said nothing. I had suspected something like this since Marcus first mentioned the strange transfers weeks ago. But hearing the number, hearing the scope of her preparation, still landed with unexpected weight. "It's not illegal," Marcus continued. "The money came from our joint accounts. She has every right to move it. But she never told me. She never asked. She just quietly built herself an escape route while I was busy pretending everything was fine." He moved away from the window and sank into the chair across from me. His hands were trembling slightly. "That's not all. The phone call I told you about, when she was talking to her mother about moving them in. I didn't tell you everything I heard." He met my eyes. "She said you were just the beginning. She said once you were gone and her parents were settled, she'd have the support system she needed to make her next move. I didn't understand what that meant at the time. Now I do." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "She wasn't just planning to replace you, Mom. She was planning to replace me too. Or at least to have everything in place in case she decided I wasn't useful anymore." The words hung in the air between us. I watched my son struggle with the recognition of who he had married, who he had defended, who he had chosen over his own mother again and again. "I knew," he said finally, his voice breaking. "That's the worst part. I knew she was treating you badly. I saw it every single day. The comments she made, the way she talked about you like you weren't even in the room, the way she made you feel like a burden for existing in your own son's house." Tears began to slide down his cheeks. But I was afraid. I was so afraid that if I said anything, if I stood up for you, I'd lose her. She'd leave me, or make my life miserable, or turn Lily against me. So I stayed quiet. I looked the other way. I let her tear you down piece by piece because I was too much of a coward to stop her. He was sobbing now, the kind of deep, shuddering sobs that come from years of suppressed guilt, finally finding release. "I chose her over you, Mom. Every single time. I chose her." "I chose her over you, and I chose her over Dad's memory." He looked at me with devastated eyes. "Dad would be so ashamed of me. He raised me better than this. He loved you so much, and I let someone treat you like garbage in your own family. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I can. I let the silence settle before I spoke. There was no satisfaction in watching my son break down. No vindication in hearing him finally acknowledge what I had endured. Only a deep, weary sadness for all the years we had lost to his fear and my silence. I forgive you, Marcus. He looked up, hope and disbelief mingling in his expression. But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to how they were. I held his gaze steadily. You can't undo 10 years of silence with one conversation. You can't rebuild trust with a single apology. Forgiveness means I'm not carrying anger toward you anymore. It means I'm willing to move forward. But moving forward doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen. You have to earn what comes next through action, not words. Through consistency, not promises. He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of what I was telling him. I understand, he said quietly. I'll do whatever it takes, however long it takes. I believed him. For the first time in years, I believed my son meant what he said. The question was whether he would have the courage to follow through when the cost became clear. Because the truth he had finally spoken wouldn't save his marriage. It would end it. And we both knew it. 9 months passed like water finding its natural course, each day flowing into the next with a rhythm I had forgotten existed. The urgency that had defined my years in Marcus's house, the constant awareness of being unwanted, the exhausting effort of making myself small enough to be tolerated, all of it had faded into memory. What remained was something I hadn't experienced since Robert was alive. Peace. My apartment had transformed from a refuge into a home. The walls held photographs now, images from different chapters of my life. Robert on our wedding day, handsome in his suit. Marcus as a boy, grinning at the camera with a baseball glove. My parents standing in front of their first house, the house Robert's foresight had preserved for me. The community center had become the center of my new life. What began as simple volunteer work had grown into something more substantial. Patricia promoted me to a formal advisory role, helping elderly residents navigate the complex terrain of family conflicts and financial exploitation. My teaching background proved surprisingly useful. I could break down complex situations into understandable pieces, identify patterns, design solutions that protected vulnerable people from those who would take advantage of them. People trusted me. They came to my small office with their fears and their suspicions, their documents and their questions. I listened the way Robert had always listened, with patience and without judgment. I helped them understand their rights, connected them with lawyers and social workers, taught them to recognize the warning signs I had missed for so long in my own life. It was the work Robert would have wanted me to do. Every person I helped felt like a conversation with him, a continuation of the protection he had built around me, extended outward to others who needed it. Marcus completed his divorce in the spring. The proceedings were contentious at times, Vanessa fighting for every asset she felt entitled to. But in the end, the settlement was fair. He kept his retirement accounts. She kept the money she had secretly accumulated. The house they had shared, the house I had helped them buy, was sold. The proceeds divided. The physical structure of their failed marriage was dismantled and distributed. He visits me every Sunday now. We have dinner together in my apartment, sharing simple meals I prepare or take out from the Thai restaurant down the street. We talk about his work, his life, the slow process of rebuilding after everything fell apart. We talk about Lily, my granddaughter, and the custody arrangement they're working toward. The conversations are different than they were before, honest in ways they never were during the years of his marriage. He asks about my work at the community center. I ask about his therapy sessions, his apartment, the life he's slowly reconstructing from the wreckage of his choices. We don't speak often about Vanessa or the years I spent in their house. Those wounds have scabbed over, but not fully healed. Sometimes Marcus will mention something in passing, a memory that surfaces unexpectedly, and I'll see the shame cross his face before he pushes it back down. He's learning to be a son again. It's slow work, awkward at times, but genuine in ways that matter more than smoothness ever could. Vanessa moved away 3 months after the divorce was finalized. She couldn't bear the whispers that followed her through grocery stores and community events, the looks that assessed and judged her wherever she went. The image she had spent years constructing had shattered beyond repair, and she lacked the tools to build something new in its place. So where? Diane heard she relocated to a city 200 miles away, somewhere she could start over as a stranger. Somewhere the name Hayes carried no history and no weight. This summer, we moved away, sun went down at the tender's entrance. The cemetery was quiet, the grass freshly mowed, the headstones casting long shadows in the early light. I brought white lilies from my windowsill, the blooms he had always loved, and placed them gently against the cool granite that bore his name. "You saved me," I said quietly, my hand resting on the stone. "Even from beyond, you saw what I refused to see, and you built walls around me that held when everything else fell apart." I paused, feeling the morning breeze move through the trees that lined the cemetery paths. "I finally understand, my love. I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. And I'm living now, really living, the way you always wanted me to." I stayed for a long time, speaking to him about the community center and the people I was helping, about Marcus's visits and the slow repair of our relationship, about Diane and the friendship we had built from shared survival. Robert didn't answer, of course, but I felt his presence in the warmth of the sun on my face, in the rustle of leaves overhead, in the peace that had finally settled into my bones. That evening, I sat on a bench in the community garden near my apartment with Diane beside me. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the kind of display that seemed too beautiful to be accidental. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Two survivors of the same quiet war, connected by loss and love and the man who had brought us together. I thought about the night I had walked out of Marcus's house with 2 suitcases and a heart full of confusion. I thought about the in-room where I had waited for anger that never came. I thought about Diane and her envelopes, Robert and the journal, that had shown me I was never as alone as I believed. They didn't lose me that night. Vanessa spoke those words. They lost the version of me that sacrificed everything to be loved. The woman who gave without receiving. The mother who accepted contempt as the price of belonging. The invisible provider who had forgotten she had the right to exist. That woman was gone, and I didn't mourn her. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving trails of purple and orange across the darkening sky. Diane reached over and patted my hand once, a simple gesture that said everything words could not. I had survived, I had rebuilt, I had found peace, and I had finally become the woman Robert always believed I could be. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. This story wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about something deeper. It was about recognizing your own worth when the people closest to you have forgotten it. It was about finding the courage to walk away from those who take you for granted, even when walking away means walking into the unknown. It was about the love that protects us even from beyond the grave, and the friendships that catch us when our families let us fall. Perhaps you saw yourself in Catherine. Perhaps you know someone like Vanessa or Marcus. Perhaps you've been the invisible provider in your own family, giving everything and receiving nothing but contempt in return. If any part of this story touched your heart, I hope it also gave you permission to believe that you deserve better, that your silence doesn't have to be permanent, that it's never too late to set boundaries and reclaim your dignity. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever had to walk away from people who refuse to see your value? Share your story with our community. You might be surprised how many others understand exactly what you've been through. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. We share stories like this every week, stories of ordinary women finding extraordinary strength in the face of betrayal and loss. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, please share this video with them. Sometimes a single story can change everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, you are never too old to become the woman you were always meant to be.